So in part 1, we talked about the near certainty that there is a time-traveling Bran in our story affecting events, and we even proposed that the Three-Eyed Crow could actually be this time-traveling Bran and not Bloodraven. And in part 2, we went over the 3 previous time travel stories that George R.R. Martin has written for some ideas on how exactly a future Bran could be time-traveling and what the very nature of time in this story could be. And so let's start off with something we are pretty certain about. Time travel in A Song of Ice and Fire is consciousness time travel. That is, there is no physical body of the time traveler going back in time, simply the consciousness, complete with all the memories. Even though memories going with the person makes no sense, as memories are physical parts of one's brain, but anyway, we can come to the fairly clear conclusion that in our story, Bran's consciousness is time traveling, complete with all of its memories, as this is the very method of time travel in For a Single Yesterday, and in Under Siege, and in Unsound Variations, and in Game of Thrones, and from what we've seen in Bran 3: A Dance with Dragons. Now, what remains a mystery is the receptacle of Bran's consciousness. You see, if Bran's consciousness is going back in time, it's likely that something is containing it. Will it be a werewood, as we saw in Bran 3? Or will it be another human being, as in Under Siege? Or will it be both, perhaps going back to a werewood and then a human being? Or perhaps no containment is necessary. Perhaps Bran's consciousness can exist in open air. After all, Varamir Sixskin's consciousness did exist briefly in open air, and Bloodraven speaks of seeing beyond the trees. Bran's consciousness existing in open air may have been the situation in Game of Thrones, but then again, Bran may have been tethered physically to his present-day body as he went back in time. After all, the Three-Eyed Raven was killed in the present, killing him in the past. Bran may have been tethered as well. And this brings up another interesting mystery. Is time-traveling Bran existing in one time, like Bruce Bunnish in Unsound Variations, or Tyrion and Keith at the end of their stories in Under Siege and For a Single Yesterday? Or is time-traveling Bran going back and forth from 2 time periods, dually existing in both, like Bran in Game of Thrones or Tyrion and Keith in much of their stories in Under Siege and For a Single Yesterday? We will need to explore these ideas. What seems to be off the table is the idea that Bran will be going into his younger self, as Keith did in For a Single Yesterday or Bruce Bunnish did in Unsound Variations. We have been inside Bran's mind and have seen his point of view, and there is no time-traveling Bran inside Bran as far as we can tell. Not to mention, we know that Hodor's life was ruined by a time-traveling Bran. While we don't know exactly when the scrambling of Hodor's mind took place, we know it must have been before Theon arrived at Winterfell, after the Greyjoy Rebellion in 289, as Theon is unaware of Hodor's real name. This means that time-traveling Bran was affecting events before the Bran that we know was born, though perhaps not before his conception. We'll talk more about this timing, though it's notable that although Bran is not taking over his younger self's body, he's still guiding his younger self's body. The same thematic elements surrounding regret and paths not taken that we see in our author's other time travel works are still contained in Ice and Fire because there are 2 Brans. Still, we need to put a pin in a couple questions. What exactly is containing time-traveling Bran's consciousness, and is time-traveling Bran existing in more than one time period? Now, switching gears, I'd like to talk about the nature of time. I propose that there are 3 likely scenarios for the nature of time in our story. First, it's possible that the nature of time is unchangeable, and that time travel is happening in a causal loop. This appears to be the time travel that was portrayed in Game of Thrones. Bran went back in time to fry Hodor's brain, which allowed Hodor to help Bran come north to gain powers, which allowed Bran to go back in time to fry Hodor's brain. Second, it's possible that the nature of time is a series of branching timelines, that any change causes reality to go down a different path into an alternate universe. There are infinite universes and infinite time-traveling Brans, and this was the nature of time in Unsound Variations. And third, it's possible that the nature of time is a single changeable timeline that gets overwritten by a change, and this was the nature of time in For a Single Yesterday and Under Siege. Now, on the first possibility, despite the show depicting an apparent causal loop, I tend to think that this will not be the nature of time travel in our story. One reason I think this is that causal loops are paradoxical in nature, and our author doesn't like paradoxes. In fact, the entire point of consciousness time travel is to try to avoid the grandfather paradox. It seems odd to utilize consciousness time travel just to fall victim to a different paradox. But the larger reason that I believe our story is not a causal loop is for thematic reasons. Causal loops push the idea of fate, that characters are helpless in a small and much larger universe. Try as they might to change their fate, they cannot, as the gods or God or the universe has a plan for them. There's usually a lesson about human hubris in these stories, and they give the audience a sense of hopelessness. Nothing we do matters. And this is just not George R.R. Martin. Our author is an atheist who writes about existentialism and the importance of human decision in determining our own destiny. A set timeline in a causal loop would go against so much that our author has written. Jaime would sit in front of the White Book entry thinking about how he can do anything he chooses with his life. Except, he can't because time is set. Brienne is asked by Lady Stoneheart to choose her essence and who she is. Except, she can't because a set timeline. Mira tells Bran and Jojen that they should fight their fate. Except, she's wrong because time is set. No, on a fundamental level, I cannot square a set timeline with George R. Martin's beliefs and writing, especially with characters like Jaime, Brienne, and Mira in the story. If humans have free will, they choose their own destiny. A set timeline throws all of this away. Now, I understand that this seems a little contradictory. We are using the Game of Thrones show as evidence of a time-traveling Bran, only to reject the nature of time portrayed in that very episode. And yes, admittedly it's odd, but the showrunners did only confirm that Hodor's brain was fried with the message "hold the door." They didn't mention anything about a time loop. On a very brief aside, it's somewhat significant to note that besides short stories and novels, George R. R. Martin wrote for television for a while and did write 2 time-traveling stories for The Twilight Zone. And both stories did toy with the idea of causal loops. In Lost and Found, a girl meets time travelers from the future who tell her that she's going to be a great diplomat, and so she decides to stop cutting class. However, the story is based on a story by Phyllis Eisenstein and isn't really our author's. The second story is The Once and Future King, where an Elvis impersonator goes back in time and accidentally kills Elvis, so he feels obligated to imitate Elvis and recreate his life in order to make it up to Elvis for killing him. This includes eventually killing himself with a drug overdose. Again, this isn't entirely our author's story, but also the nature of time is purposely rather ambiguous. We don't know if our protagonist was imitating himself or if he was painstakingly choosing to recreate Elvis's life in the ultimate act of being an Elvis impersonator. The story speaks to the concept of human creativity and the nature of the self. We don't know how much of our actions are ours or the environment influencing us. It's an interesting story and once again involves suicide, but it's fundamentally different from Ice and Fire as the protagonist is choosing to keep the future the same, while Ice and Fire is about trying to change the future. Let's keep in mind, in the first dream between the Three-Eyed Crow and Bran, Bran is shown some sort of problem beyond a white barrier in the north. North and north and north he looked, to the curtain of light at the end of the world, and then beyond that curtain. He looked deep into the heart of winter, and then he cried out, afraid. And the heat of his tears burned on his cheeks. "Now you know," the crow whispered as it sat on his shoulder. "Now you know why you must live." And so it appears that there's some sort of problem and Bran is needed to deal with that problem. However, in a universe where the timeline is set, Bran would not be needed. Nothing could be averted, so there would be no point in trying. And so while this may be controversial, I'm going to eliminate the possibility of a set timeline and causal loop from our story. Next, we need to talk about branching timelines, the nature of time and unsound variations. And for this possibility, I also doubt that it's the nature of time in our story. So let's assume that the Three-Eyed Crow is being honest and the world is in peril and only Bran can save it. Okay, great. In a world of branching timelines, though, there are infinite universes. This means that regardless of what our characters do, there are some universes out there where everything turns out great, and some universes out there where everything turns out badly. The choices of our characters don't really do anything except determine which universe they arrive in. The good and bad results exist regardless. And so the stakes are actually lowered quite a bit with branching timelines, as the universe is not really in peril. Yes, we care more about our versions of the characters and what happens to them, but it diminishes the preciousness of characters' lives to know that there are infinite other versions of them out there. Who cares that Ned died when there are infinite more Neds who didn't? Now, in Unsound Variations, an essential plot point is that Bruce Bunnish is a selfish jerk. He didn't care about the fate of any particular universe, only that he arrived in one that was pleasurable to him where he won. This is contrasted with the protagonist of Unsound Variations, who specifically does not want to time travel because he would be leaving his specific girlfriend who he cares about. And this is a huge point. For an unselfish individual in a branching timeline system, there really is no point to time traveling, as one would not be embettering the lives of those they care about. One would only be traveling to a universe where alternate versions of the ones one cares about exist. And the ones the time traveler specifically cared about, the ones from his original universe, would lose him. As Unsound Variations shows, time travel in a branching timeline situation really sucks. Now, we could perhaps assume that Time Traveling Bran is selfish like Bruce Bunnish, and that he is just trying to arrive in a universe where he can continue on living. Perhaps he plans on taking over present-day Bran's body in the end, or something nefarious. Except this timeline includes a dead Ned, a dead Catelyn, a dead Robb, a dead Luwin, a dead Jory, a dead Roderick, a dead Mikken, probably a dead Nan, so many others, and a paralyzed Bran to boot. It's a pretty bad timeline for Bran. I mean, perhaps it's the best option, but it simply doesn't seem like a time-traveling Bran would be selfishly gunning for this outcome. And because of this, I'm going to eliminate the possibility of branching timelines in our story, which means we are left with the single changeable timeline option, which works much better with our story as 1, characters have the ability to actually change outcomes, and 2, stakes are kept high as the universe and the characters we know within it are actually in peril. In fact, it's actually difficult to imagine how an avert the apocalypse tale would work with an unchangeable timeline or multiple universes. In the former case, actions don't matter, and in the latter case, the apocalypse is not so apocalyptic. Now, the single changeable timeline is what time was like in Under Siege and For a Single Yesterday. Under Siege specifically is the story that most resembles Ice and Fire. Like Ice and Fire, we have a character using time travel in an attempt to prevent an apocalypse. In fact, it's the only other George R.R. Martin time travel story where time travel is utilized for more than just selfish reasons. Keith in For a Single Yesterday and Bruce Bunnish in Unsound Variations were only thinking of themselves, and Bran in Game of Thrones sort of stumbled into time travel. It's unclear why Bran was brought into the past, and it didn't seem like he knew what he was doing when he scrambled Hodor's mind. So, accepting that both Ice and Fire and Under Siege are apocalyptic averting tales with single changeable timelines, let's bring back the two issues we had talked about earlier. What is the receptacle of time-traveling Bran's consciousness, and is time-traveling Bran existing in one time period, the present, or is he going back and forth between two time periods, the present and the future? So what's interesting about Under Siege, and For a Single Yesterday, and even Bran 3, is that our characters are first capable of time travel, but have difficulty actually changing the past. Tyrion tries repeatedly to change human minds and fails. Keith talks about how he cannot change anything in the past, and Bran has trouble speaking to his father. And with this, we have the inverse of the butterfly effect. The timelines in George R.R. Martin's stories are relatively stable and resistant to brief visits from time travelers. However, in both Under Siege and For a Single Yesterday, there is a sacrifice, specifically a suicide that keeps a person in the past. Incidentally, Unsound Variations and The Once and Future King also involve death to keep someone in the past. And it's only after that sacrifice, that suicide, that there is now persistent influence from the time traveler that can finally move the timeline. Keith never joins the colony, maybe. Tyrion causes a different president to get elected. And so, although it perhaps doesn't matter too much, because we are seeing time-traveling Bran affect change, I tend to think time-traveling Bran has already died or killed himself in the future to keep his consciousness in the past. It's perhaps possible that time-traveling Bran is existing in two time periods, with his future being post-apocalyptic and a mostly dead world, but if that were the case, I'm not sure what the point of training present-day Bran would be. Present-day Bran seems to be being groomed as a replacement for the Three-Eyed Crow. A powerful future Bran who survived the apocalypse would have no need for a replacement. He could continue making time-traveling changes on his own. And so I would imagine present-day Bran serves as a backup plan. If time-traveling Bran fails to avert the apocalypse, present-day Bran can go back in time and try again. In fact, perhaps this has been done countless times. Of course, there is the question of why time-traveling Bran can't just go back in time on his own if he fails in his quest. And this is hard to say, but if time-traveling Bran has truly died in the future, this means he would be currently living a second life in the present. His body, the body of a skin changer, would be gone, and now he's just consciousness, incapable of time travel again, though apparently still capable of at least sending dreams via the werewood net. And if Varamir Sixskins is correct about second lives, time-traveling Bran would be slowly losing himself over time. And so I do tend to think that time-traveling Bran is in the present, in the same period as regular Bran, living a second life. But if so, where is he exactly? Is he in the werewood somewhere? In the background? Perhaps. Regular Bran time-traveled with the werewood, so one would think that time-traveling Bran would do it as well. However, regular Bran doesn't seem to notice any time-traveling Bran anywhere. But then again, he doesn't notice Bloodraven when he's in the werewood either. Time-traveling Bran could be there in the background. Or time-traveling Bran could conceivably be in a different werewood. Perhaps he's at the Isle of Faces, though it's exceedingly difficult for Bran to travel there being paralyzed. Then again, we have no idea if time-traveling Bran was paralyzed. Time-traveling Bran, being a previous iteration of Bran, could have lived a rather different life. In fact, the only thing we really know about time-traveling Bran is that he looks and sounds like Bran to Ghost. And this is assuming that it was in fact time-traveling Bran who appeared to Ghost back in A Clash of Kings. And this does bring up another interesting point. Time-traveling Bran has great powers, much like regular Bran, which are derived from genetics, and assuming that was time-traveling Bran in A Clash of Kings, time-traveling Bran looks like regular Bran. It appears that time-traveling Bran is genetically the same as regular Bran. And that's a pretty big deal. There's a lot of fan speculation out there about how much of the timeline was altered or influenced by a time-traveling Bran. Was Bran the Builder actually time-traveling Bran? Was Brandon the Shipwright actually time-traveling Bran? Did time-traveling Bran scramble Aerys' mind to make him crazy? And while these are all interesting ideas, we have to remember that a time-traveling Bran would not want to do anything that would prevent himself from being born. Bran is genetically special, presumably more so than his siblings or possible siblings. And the Three-Eyed Crow tells us that it's Bran specifically who needs to live to save the world. In order for Bran's unique genetic composition to come about, Ned and Catelyn would need to have sex at the right moment with the right sperm reaching the right egg. This is very delicate timing. Any messing with the timeline prior to this sex jeopardizes Bran's existence. If we want to bring in the possibility of other time travelers, maybe some shenanigans was going on prior to Bran's birth. But for a time-traveling Bran, he would want to leave everything exactly as it is until his conception. And then at that point, he can go buck wild and start messing with things. Force himself into a coma, send himself visions, have the reeds show up, whatever. And this is why the frying of Hodor's mind is so interesting. And we will talk all about the Hodoring of young Walder in part 4. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.